Hey guys, we are the Null Operators, and this is video number 2 in our Learning How to Code in Java series. Today we'll be covering selection structures. So, what are selection structures? Well, up until now, when we write our code, it all happens in sequence, right? It's linear. One thing happens after the next. What selection structures allow us to do is create branches in the program. So if up here is the start, I can go down, say I get the user's input or something like that. I do a calculation. And then here I can check the answer. And based on what the answer is, I can have different outcomes. So outcome 1 and outcome 2. And these outcomes could be anything from changing a variable's value to printing a different message. The point is just that selection structures allow us to have branches in our program where if this thing happens, then run this bit of code. Otherwise, run this other bit of code. So let's take a look at how that actually looks in code. So first things first, I'm going to open up IntelliJ. Today we'll be working in IntelliJ just so that you can see different IDEs, and maybe if it appeals to you, you can swap over, or just to get comfortable with these things. It's good to be comfortable with as many tools as possible. So I'll create a new project. This is in Java. I don't need any of these libraries, so I'll just click Next. And we want to create it from a command line app. And I will just call this selection structure test. So now we have our code here. The shell that we always have, public class, whatever, public static void main. And let's get started with refreshing some of the old stuff. So we went over variables and data types before. So let's create a variable. Let's say we were reading in a number from the user. Let's say we're reading in an integer from the user. So I'll just say int input, and I'll leave it uninitialized. And since we're getting it from the user, I need to tell them a message saying that we want it from them, right? So I'll say, please enter a number. And in order to read it from the user, we need to create a scanner, if you remember from our last video. So what we have to do for that is first steps first, import the scanner. So we go import java.util.scanner. Then we need to create the scanner object. So I'll say scanner, and I'm going to call mine scan is equal to a new scanner with system.in. So now we can actually use that scanner to read whatever the user puts on the screen. So we'll say input is equal to scan.nextInt. So that's what we learned before. Let's introduce the new material. So we have two different types of selection structures. There's the if statement, where it's if some condition, let's say if input is greater than 0, then something will happen. And there's a couple of things that we can add on to this if statement. So with the if statement, you can just have the if. You can have also an if else, which is saying if the first thing is true, run this. Otherwise, run this. So if true, run this. Otherwise, run this. So you can see an if statement by itself, like we had before. So you can see it like that. You can see it with an else attached to it. And you can also see it with any number of else ifs attached to the middle. So in between these two, you can add else ifs. So say else if input is equal to 0, then we'll run this. And you'll notice that I put two equal signs here. So these are conditions, right? They're Boolean expressions is what they're called. So these symbols basically look at the two values and they'll return whether or not this is true or false. So this is saying, this is evaluating to if true, do this, or if false, don't do this, basically. So the equals sign is the comparison operator. Whereas before we have the single equals, if I want to assign something, if I want to say input is equal to this thing, then I'm just going to put one equal sign. But if I want to compare, if I want to say check to see if these are equal, you use two equal signs. So we have if input's greater than 0, this thing runs. Otherwise, if input is 0, this thing runs. Otherwise, in all circumstances, this thing runs. So that's important with the else. The else is in all other circumstances, because the way this works is the program's going to check the first one first. If it's true, it'll run this and it'll ignore the rest of the if-else chain. But if it's not true, then it moves down to the next else if or whatever's below it, and it checks that. If this is true, it runs this and ignores everything else in the chain. Otherwise, it moves down and checks the next thing. If it reaches the else will run no matter what. So the else is kind of like your catch-all. If I reach the else, that means that this code is going to run no matter what. And like we talked about before, we could have numerous else ifs in between this if and this else. So I could have else if input is less than 0, then we would run this. So let's actually write some real code with this then. So we have input from the user. If input is greater than 0, I'm going to print out a message that says input is positive, because numbers greater than 0 are positive, right? Now, if it is 0, we can just send a message that says the input is 0. And if it's less than 0, we'll send a message that says the input is negative. And our else, all we're going to say here is something went wrong. Because if we get a number that is not positive, not negative, and not 0, something crazy is happening. So let's run this and test it out. It tells us to enter a number. I'm going to enter -15, and I get input is negative. So if we look at this, -15 is input, right? -15 is not greater than 0, so this gets ignored. -15 is not 0, so this gets ignored. But -15 is less than 0, so I get input is negative printed to the screen, and then it ignores the rest of the chain. So if we run this again, and let's say we entered 0, I gotta click inside of my output screen, we get input is 0. So that's what I mean by branching, is that different things can happen based on the different conditions that you use for, in this case, an if statement. So that's an if statement. What about the other selection structure? The other selection structure is called a switch statement. So if I delete this, actually, I'll keep it here and I'll comment it out. So if you ever want to comment out multiple lines of code, you put /*, and then you go down to the bottom of where you want to finish commenting, and you do */. So everything in here is not code that's actually going to run. It's just a comment, and you can uncomment it if you later decide that you do want it to run. So down below this, we'll create our switch statement. And again, we're going to look at input, the number that the user gave us. And what a switch statement does is it looks at a variable or a value, and it tries to match it up with cases. So we'll create some cases down here, like case 0. And then I'll print out input is 0. And the next part's important here. We want to include a break. So break is a keyword, and it stops us from moving down to the next case, which I'll elaborate on once I finish typing out some cases here. So we'll do boom, boom. So let's say we have case 1, case -1, case 5. You notice these don't have to be in order. They're just kind of all over the place. That's perfectly fine. So here we would say input is 1. And then down here we'll have -1. And finally input is 5. Now, kind of like the if statement, right? If we go back up here, we had a catch-all, which was the else. Oh, which I somehow got rid of. Let's type that back in there. Else system.out.println. something went wrong. So this else is the catch-all. If none of the things above it run, it is guaranteed to run. We have something similar for the switch statement. It's called the default case. If I don't hit any of the cases above me, I am guaranteed to run this default case. So for our default case, we'll just send out a message saying, could not match with any of the other cases. And then we'll include our break. So let's talk about that break. I mentioned that this stops you from moving down to the other cases below you. With the if statement, if one of these things ran, it ignored all the other ones. With the switch statement, each case, it'll run whatever's inside of the case if it matches up with it, right? If I find the 0, then I'll run this code. But if I don't include the break, I'll also run the code for 1 because it's below it. And it'll continue doing that until it finds a break. So if I have no breaks, it'll run every single case below the one that it matched with. And we don't want that, right? So we want to make sure that we're including all of these breaks. In fact, I'll leave off the first one just to show you how that looks. So we'll run this code. And I know my first case is 0. So I'll enter a 0. And I get 2 messages. I get input is 0 and input is 1. So input is 0 is the message up here. Input is 1 is the message down here. And that's because I did not include my break. I continued down to the second case. So if I do include my break and I run that again and enter a 0, we'll see we only get the 1. And now let's test out our default case just so you can see that in action. So I have case 0, 1, -1, and 5. Let's say I enter a 99. It'll tell me it could not match with any of the other cases. So that's it for selection structures. We have our if statement and our switch statement. Let us know if you have any questions in the comments down below. And please remember to make sure to like and subscribe the video. It helps us out a lot. And in the next video, we'll be covering loops.